So hopefully you're going to get something. You may not get it all. You may not be there at the end, but if you can just get something. I mean, turn your neighbor and tell them, get something out of this. As I was preparing, as David already mentioned, it's word, Devarim, words. And I thought, isn't that just like Yahweh? How many realize it's been quite dry the past few weeks? There's been a shortage of rain. And yet we get up this morning and we find that the rain has arrived. And isn't it interesting that his word is likened unto the latter rain? Isn't that powerful? You know, a lot of times, especially here in Oregon, there's a lot of rain, isn't there? And so we begin to take it for granted. In fact, you get ready for it to go, to leave. You're tired of it. And we lose sight of how important it is. And then yet we find when we go through a dry spell how important that rain is, don't we? Do you realize the same thing can be said of his word? When you're constantly surrounded by his presence and you constantly have access to that word, we can take it for granted, don't we? It's there. It's always going to be there. There it is. And yet we're told there's a famine coming in the end days, and it's going to be a famine of his word. And we're being reminded, we're being given these unctions, these gentle reminders that don't take this Devarim for granted. Put it in. Store it up. It's necessary. It's vital. It becomes life or death, doesn't it? His Devarim. If you'll turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 1, we're going to look at this week's Torah portion. And if you've been following along on the Torah portion cycle, then you know that we just finished out the book of Numbers. We're now in the book of Deuteronomy, the final book of the Torah, the 5 books of Moshe. And we find that this Torah portion is titled Devarim, words, but it's also the name of the entire book. The entire book is titled Devarim, the words. And if you've read the Torah portion, you know there's this sense of finality that's being shared with the children of Israel. And Moshe, it's his final discourse to them. Because we find that, guess what? The 40 years are finally over. And the generation that's standing here listening to these words, they're the ones that actually made it. All the graves have been dug. All those that are going to be dealt with and judged in the wilderness have finally been cut off. And now, with a big sigh of relief, they can go into the land. And so we find that the book of Deuteronomy seems to be this farewell speech that Moshe is sharing with the children of Israel because he's not going in either. And yet, when you begin to look, especially when you begin to study these Torah portions, you'll find that Deuteronomy seems to be a little bit different than the rest of the books, doesn't it? Especially when you try to study this book. Deuteronomy can be a very difficult book to try and break down and decipher. It seems as if every year as we go through these Torah portion cycles, there can be some difficult ones, but when you hit Deuteronomy, it's like a wall. It reads different. It's written different. There's just something that's a little bit unique about this book. And I found that upon closer examination, it's amazing because Deuteronomy is structured different. It is different. In fact, we find that when you begin to look at the way the book is laid out, it's laid out in the same format as an ancient treaty document. And so we find that before the children of Israel are going to enter into the land, what Moshe is sharing with them is it's literally he's writing down and giving them the official document, the official deed. This is your covenant. You're going to agree. You're going to sign on the dotted line. Yahweh's going to sign on the dotted line. And now here's your deed. Here it is, all encased, nicely written with the different parts of any covenant. And here you go. It's official. You've walked it out, you've wandered around for 40 years, and here you go. Here's the title deed. In fact, you'll find that Deuteronomy is written with the preamble, a historical prologue. Covenantal obligations begin to be outlined, blessings and curses, and finally at the end, a concluding section. And some people may think, well, that's an interesting historical fact. The book happens to be written just like an ancient treaty. Well, that's interesting, and we chalk it up to nothing more than that. And yet we've got to think about this. This is directly before the children of Israel are going to go into the Promised Land. And we find that the last thing that's on Yahweh's mind before he sends them across, the final thoughts of Moshe, the final things that he's going to share with them, after everything they've been through and all that they've seen, is he's giving them the official covenant document, the treaty that's being cut with the great king. It's quite interesting because when we begin to fathom what's happening here, we have to realize that at Sinai, the generation that first heard the words of this covenant, they're all gone. They're all cut off. They've died off in the wilderness. because they didn't understand these covenant obligations. And now we find that another generation has been raised up in the wilderness. And it's a generation that's obviously been obedient up to this point, haven't they? Or else they wouldn't be there. Turn to your neighbor and say, see, I'm warning you. So we find here that this is a generation, they know it, they've obviously lived it. For the past 40 years, they've grown up in this, they've been obedient, and yet it's so important that the final things, they need to be given the official document. They need to have it. They need to have this deed. And so let's look at this. Why is it significant? Do you think that it might have something to do with their ability to conquer the land, to stay in the land? Do you think that this covenant document, their understanding of these Devarim, these words, is going to affect what happens when they cross the Jordan? That maybe it's so important that they understand it because what happens is going to depend upon how they hear, how they accept, how they walk out these Devarim. Well, if you have your scriptures, turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. It starts off as saying, "These be the words which Moshe spake unto all Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain over against the Red Sea, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazarot and Dizahab." And then there's a parenthetical statement inserted, which is quite comical. When we can look back and laugh now. "There are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea," which is the point where they're going to cross from. It took them 40 years, but it was only supposed to be an 11-day journey. And it's kind of comical now. Wow, they wandered around for 40 years and it was just 11. It was right there. And yet, we have to think, what about us? How many times have we wandered around this mountain? How many years have we been going through the same thing? It was just an 11-day journey. It's right there. It's right in front of us. And yet we find that if we're not willing to understand the Devarim, we continue to wonder, don't we? In verse 3 it says, "And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moshe spoke unto the children of Israel according unto all that Yahweh had given him in commandment unto them." And we find that it then begins to go into this treaty document, the preamble, giving the history of the relationship between Yahweh and this people that becomes the foundation of why they're going to have a covenant together, of why he's willing to enter into this treaty with Israel. But I want to focus on this term, words. It's the title of the portion and it's the title of the book. Everything seems to be hinging upon these words that are being spoken, the words that are coming from the mouth of Yahweh. In Hebrew, most of you are probably familiar with this term. It's Strong's number 1697. It's the word dabar. Can you say that with me? Dabar. And we know that whenever we look at the Hebrew language, that there's often a blessed meaning and a curse meaning. And it's no different with this term dabar. We find that it can mean a promised word, as in the covenant is a promised word from Yahweh, but yet this can change just slightly and it becomes debar, and it becomes a pestilence, a cursing word, a word that destroys and devours. And it seems as if the Devarim, however we accept the debar, what we do with it then seems to maybe determine whether it becomes this promised word, a blessing, or whether it becomes a pestilence that devours. The definition of this term debar itself is speech, word, a speaking thing. But it's interesting because it can also infer one who has a cause. And it's dealing within a legal sense. And now remember, we've already gave the opinion and said that this document, this book of Deuteronomy, seems to be a treaty document, a covenant, the official write-up, just as if you were going to strike a contract in business. You have this legal document so that no one can say, well, you didn't say that. No, it's written. Here it is, and you signed, so we have this document. Well, we find that if the book of Deuteronomy is in fact this treaty, this legal document, isn't it interesting that the very title, Devarim, is reminding us and dealing with someone who has a cause in a legal sense. In fact, from the word debar, we get the word dibra, and it means a cause, a reason, something in order that, for the purpose of, for the sake of, in a forensic sense, which means relating to or suitable for a court of law. So it seems then that as we're beginning to lay this foundation that maybe these words, these Devarim that are being spoken, it seems as if Yahweh's letting you know it's for the purpose of you to have a claim to the inheritance. They're being given to you so that you could have a legal right to go and claim the land when you cross the Jordan. These words give you the legal foundation that's needed for you to take possession. Well, how many of you realize that all of you have been given an inheritance by Yahweh as well? All of us are entitled to these covenant promises if we're willing to sign our name to the dotted line. And yet we find that there's a lot of times that the enemy comes and he contests those inheritances, doesn't he? He comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and it seems as if many today in the house are dealing with the inheritance being stolen, aren't you? You're dealing with the enemy attacking your finances, your health, your home, your peace, your shalom. And we find that he's doing everything he can to steal it, and yet no matter how much we jump up and down and scream and shout, it's not changing anything, is it? It seems as if he's still being productive. And yet it seems maybe we've been handling these things wrong. Maybe instead of whining and crying and complaining, which to be honest can be our habit the moment things don't go our way, maybe it's about a change of mindset. Maybe he's reminding us it's time to go and present our case in a legal sense, to come before the judge. How many of you realize that Yahweh sits as the righteous judge? And we're being reminded that if you in fact have listened to the Devarim, to the words, and you have this covenant promise, then you have a legal cause. You have a legal right to these promises. You have a foundation to stand on. And the enemy, if you'll plead this case, then he has to go. He has to return what belongs to you. Well, I don't know about you, but that's exciting to me. Let's look at this term, debar. Let's break it down, because we need to understand, what are we to do with this Devarim? How does this affect us? How do we have a legal cause? How do we apply it? Well, debar is spelled with the dalet, the beit, and the resh. And we understand that in Hebrew, every single letter has a going into the individual letters, and we can begin to look at the definition of that letter. And it begins to define exactly what he means when he says, this is the Devarim, these are the words. The letter dalet is the picture of a door. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the way it's written, it's two intersecting lines. But there's a little point that hangs off of where these lines intersect. And that little overhang is called the ear. And when I saw this, I was instantly reminded of the verses concerning the bondservant. A servant that was set free, they had served their tenure, it was time for them to go. But if they loved their master and wanted to continue to serve, they would lend their ear to the door, and their ear would be pierced. And it was an indicator, a mark of who they belonged to. They were a bondservant. They belonged forever to their master because they had lent their ear to his doorframe. So when we begin to look at this term debar, we begin to see there's something to do with you having a legal right and you being an individual that would lend your ear to the door, being one that would hear, that would listen to these words. And it's quite interesting because our understanding of to hear is quite different from a Hebrew perspective of what it means to hear. For us, when we say, we heard you, it literally means just physically our ears, we heard sound, it came in. But from a Hebrew mindset, when they say to shema, to hear, it means not only that you hear something, but that you understand it. And then, in turn, you obey it. So hearing without action, then we really didn't shema, did we? Because it'll be seen in our obedience. Well, let's look a little bit further. It's connected to the letter beit. The letter beit represents the house. And here we find Israel's about to enter into the house of Yahweh. The land of Israel was his house. And we find they're about to cross the threshold, go through the door into his house. This is connected to the letter resh. The letter resh represents the head, the chief one, the one that's in authority, a position of authority. And so when we attach these meanings together, these different Hebrew letters, it begins to give a definition to this term debar and what debar means and why it's so important that we hear the debar, that we hear the words, that we understand the words. We find that when you pull these definitions together, it literally causes us to ask the question, could it be that in order to have a legal cause and a right to access the door to the house of the chief one, to have a legal right to enter into the house of Yahweh, the promised land, that it seems as if it's only going to be granted to those that would lend their ear, to those that would hear his Devarim, his words. In other words, the only way you're going to get access into the house, the only way you're going to get access and be able to claim and have a legal right to these covenant promises, to the provision, to the protection, to the peace that can be found in his presence, is if we're obedient to Shema, to the Devarim, to hear, to understand, to be obedient to the words. And I believe that this was a generation that fully understood that, didn't they? Because they just watched an entire generation before them who weren't obedient. The consequences. They weren't allowed to enter into the house. To be disobedient, to not hear the words properly, was a life and death situation. So we find then that if this is truly the case, if this is what's taking place here, it seems then that it's setting a precedent, isn't it? That the only way then that you and I can gain access into his house as well is by hearing his debar. This becomes the doorway. This becomes the way that you have a right to gain entrance. And as I began to look at this, I was instantly reminded of John chapter 10, verse 4. Because we find that Yeshua shares the exact same message with the people of his day that Moshe is sharing with the children of Israel here before they cross into the land. In fact, if you'll turn with me to chapter 10 of John, in fact, the whole chapter really will give you a better understanding, but we're going to pick out some key verses. And you're going to begin to see that it's going to change the whole tone of what's taking place here when we plug in this understanding. We understand that at the beginning of John, we're told that Yeshua is the Word made flesh. He's the Debar. He's the physical presence of the Debar walking in the earth. So when we say that the Debar is the door and Yeshua says that he's the door, it's not something different, it's the same thing. He's the living, walking, breathing Debar, and he's reminding them, this is the door. You're going to come through me. This is the access point. In verse 4 of John chapter 10, he makes a statement. It's the analogy where he's proclaiming that he's the good shepherd. And in verse 4 he says, and when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. And it says, this parable spoke Yeshua unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spoke unto them. And then Yeshua said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. We find then that Yeshua begins to share with them the exact same thing that you see in the word Devar itself. The sheep hear my voice. Their ear is attached to this door. Another voice they will not follow. And because they've attached their ear to this door and they listen to my words, they're able to go in and out and find pasture. They find the provisions that are there for those that are in covenant. But we're going to look at some of these terms in the Greek. We're going to look at that phrase, to find pasture. The word find there in the Greek, heurisko, it means to find by inquiry, an examination, scrutiny, observation, to find out by practice and experience. And it seems to be describing a diligent search that's made for something specific. A lot of times when we read this verse, I don't know about you, but you have the idea of they stumbled upon it. They came across it, you fell over it, it was right in your way. They found pasture when they came to Yeshua, and yet that's not what he's telling them. He's revealing to them, if you will diligently seek me out, if you will search me, I'm a rewarder of those that diligently seek me. If you will learn me, if you will hear my words, if you will examine me and ask and inquire, then you'll find the pasture. Well, let's look at this term pasture. And I got to say, when I began to look at this term, I almost fell out my seat. Because this is quite interesting. It reads completely different, even in the Greek, than what we see in the English. In the Greek, this word is nome, and it means pasturage, fodder, or food, but it comes from the root word that completely changes the argument about how Yeshua felt about the law. It comes from the root word nomos. And in Greek, nomos is the exact same word translated countless times throughout the New Testament, meaning the law, the Torah. In other words, when you take it back to the roots, Yeshua just made the statement, I'm the good shepherd. If you hear my voice, you'll be able to access the door. And what will you find when you access this door? You'll find the Torah. You'll find the law. You realize that completely changes the argument? We find that what he was revealing to them, and this is why we find that they begin to get angry and they don't understand, what are you talking about? Here they were. They thought they knew the Torah. They thought they knew the law. And yet we find that what Yeshua was revealing to them in the past, they've been disobedient. They've caused this covenant to become null and void. They've caused this relationship to become something that was fractured. And yet we find that what Yeshua is revealing to them is that I've come to restore your covenant privileges. If you will listen to me, if you will access this door, then the very document that will provide for you and give you a right to your inheritance, you'll have access to that. Diligently seek me, and you'll find the Torah. Diligently seek me, and you'll find this covenant treaty that will change your circumstances, that will change your life. We find that when we begin to listen to his words, that he gives us understanding of our covenantal agreement. He begins to graft us back in, and we are given a treaty of peace. Even though we've been disobedient in the past, even though we've been guilty of breaking these very words, because he came, once again, you can have access to the house of the great king if we'll tune our ears to his words. Isn't that powerful? Do you realize that the exact same thing is happening here in this Torah portion? You're dealing with the generation that has been birthed out of a group of individuals that became cut off. They were disobedient. They broke the terms of the covenant, and because of that, Yahweh had every right to cancel the agreement. They broke it, not him. And yet we find that Moshe is reminding this generation that even though the ones that have come before you are cut off because they rejected these very same words, you now can once again access the house. You can come in, you can receive your inheritance, but it's only if you'll lend your ear to the door. It's only if you'll listen to the Devarim, the words of Yahweh. And so we find that this last book, this book of Deuteronomy, it's becoming this formal write-up. It's the contract. It's the treaty. It's the covenant that would give Israel the legal right, the authority to cross into Yahweh's house. Because do you realize that the enemy is not going to allow you to claim your inheritance without a fight? You better have a foundation, ducks in a row, because if there's an open door that was left open, or maybe a window that we forgot to shut, and an access point that we didn't cut off, and we allowed him some wiggle room, if you give him an inch, he takes a mile, doesn't he? And we find that this is exactly what Israel was facing. There were giants in the land. The enemy had set up camp in the promised land. So even though they had this legal document claiming that it's my land, I have a right to it, they had to go and take it. They had to go and possess it. And the only way they were going to be able to do that was to understand the Devarim, to understand they had a legal foundation. They had every right to that land. Amen? You realize what if we started taking that position as well? What if any time the enemy came up and decided he was going to steal from you and take your inheritance, that you begin to get up and shake yourself and say, no, I have a legal right. I have the covenant right here. His Devarim are written on my heart, and you're not going to steal my inheritance because he gave it to me and it's mine. Amen? Well, as we continue to look at this, we find that it's not an accident, because he tells you exactly when this legal document's being written up, being shared with the people. We're told that it's during the 11th month, which happens to be on the Hebrew calendar the month of Shevat. And we see this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 3, the first day of the 11th month in the 40th year. Well, that's not important to us until we begin to look at the importance of numbers. Why does he include it? Why do we need to know when this is taking place? Well, let's look at that number 11, because numbers have meaning. Numbers are important. 11 happens to be the number throughout the scriptures that's always associated with disorder, chaos, judgment. It's associated with the irresponsibility of breaking the law, of breaking the Torah. Isn't that interesting? It becomes a very apt description of where we are today, doesn't it? We may not be in the 11th month on the physical calendar, but the days that we're living in are aptly described by that number 11. A generation has been raised up that is full of disorder, chaos. They are irresponsible, and we continually break the very laws of Yahweh that have been given to us. And yet, let's look a little further at this number 11. The 11th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Kaf. And remember, we understand that every single Hebrew letter has a corresponding picture. It has its own definition. Well, the Hebrew letter Kaf is the picture of the palms of the hand or the soles of the feet, which really doesn't make a lot of sense until you plug this into the culture, to the ancient Near Eastern cultures. They understood that the palms of the hand, the soles of the foot, they represented ownership. It represented authority. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 24, they're told that every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. It was the legal foundation to the land. Wherever they walked, that was their inheritance because the soles of their feet had trod upon it, and it was an indicator that this was now under their authority, under their ownership. Now you know why you should be very careful of who you let into your home. You should be very careful when you allow the enemy to be entertained in your house, because the same thing goes for him as well. You give him an inch, he begins to walk around up and down in your house and your inheritance. The same thing goes. It becomes his. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. We find then that as we look at this number 11, on the one hand, it's a number of disorder, chaos, lawbreakers, lawlessness. But on the other hand, 11 reminds them of the fact that there's an inheritance to be had. There's some authority that they need to take in order to claim that inheritance. The palms of the hand, the soles of the feet. And it seems as if maybe then that as this generation is standing there and they're hearing these words in the 11th month, that they're being revealed to them that this is a time of decision. An entire generation made their choice. They chose to be a generation that would not heed the words of Yahweh. They chose to continue in disorder, chaos, breaking the law. And we find now that the branch that sprung up out of them now once again is standing and hearing the words of Yahweh. And they're being asked, are you going to follow in the footsteps of your forefathers who broke my law? Are you going to follow in the steps of those that continued to cause disorder in the camp? Are you going to be the generation that's going to raise up and hear the Devarim, hear the words, and therefore go in and possess the land? And we find that the choice is up to us. Turn to your neighbor and ask them, what do you choose? And that becomes a very interesting question, doesn't it? Because we find that just as Israel was standing here, they're at the river, they're about to cross the Jordan, they're being asked, what are you going to do with it? Well, guess what? The same question is being asked of you and I today, isn't it? We find that an entire generation is being raised up that's disorderly, chaotic, full of lawlessness. And yet you're being reminded there's an inheritance that's still waiting to be claimed. There's an inheritance that's waiting for you to take dominion over and to fulfill the call. And the question is going forth, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to be one that takes possession? Are you going to be one that follows in the footsteps of the forefathers? Well, let's look at this term, Shavat. We've said that the 11th month is the month of Shavat. It's interesting because it's a wordplay with the term Shabbat, a time of rest. And yet, is not the Shabbat as well a weapon of our warfare? When we keep Sabbath, it marks you. It indicates who you belong to. It gives you access to the house of Yahweh. It will separate you. It draws a line in the sand. That's what the Shabbat does. Well, this term, Shavat, it's Strong's number 7627, and it's translated as meaning a rod, a scepter, a shepherd's staff, which was interesting because, remember, we looked at John chapter 10, where Yeshua makes the statement, I'm the good shepherd. So keep that in the back of your mind. Remember that. But we also understand that the rod is a symbol of the authority of the one bearing it. Just as the scepter is the symbol of the king's authority. The rod is the symbol of authority, one who has dominion, one who has a right. In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 37, we see a reference to this same word, Shavat, to the rod of the shepherd. In Ezekiel 20:37, it says, and I will cause you to pass under the rod, under the Shavet, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. We find that what he's using an analogy that Israel would have understood because they were shepherds. And to pass under the rod was a method that the shepherd used to count his flocks. You don't just let anyone go under your rod. You're letting your sheep go under your rod. You're counting, making sure you're not missing one of them, making sure they're all there and accounted for. But also as they pass under the rod, we find that it was a time when they're being inspected, examined. He's examining his flock as they pass under the rod. And we find that the same analogy is used of what he's going to do to us in the last days when he gathers us. You're going to be made to pass under the rod. Why? We've been scattered. We've been dispersed. And he's about to count all of those that belong and are coming back that are going to enter into his house. And as you're being counted, you're being inspected. Making sure, wait, is this one of my sheep or is this one of the others? Whose house does this one belong in? He's inspecting you, looking at you, examining you. Now you can begin to understand why a lot of people don't want to have to go again and keep Torah, go under the law. Why? Because it's going to require you to be examined. It's going to require you to be inspected. And we find that that's often not very fun, is it? Because if he examines us and begins to point out some areas, that means we have to deal with it, doesn't it? And we find that if we don't deal with it, the loving Father that he is, he will deal with it. And we find that this is exactly the analogy that's being inferred here with this idea of the rod. They're passing under the rod. And here, as Israel stands on this side of the Jordan, this same analogy is being revealed to them. As you stand here, you're passing under the rod. You're entering into the covenant. You're being counted. You're being examined to see if you're worthy to enter in, if you're one who has an inheritance in his house. But the interesting thing as I began to look at this is that the way that a shepherd would identify his sheep is that the sheep's ears were often bored through or distinctively notched as a mark of identification. Isn't that funny? The bondservant's ears were notched, marked as a sign of identification of the fact that they belonged to their master. Yeshua declares that he's the good shepherd. Why? Because he's doing the same thing the physical shepherds would do. Your ears are marking you of whether or not you belong to his flock. Our hearing marks us as whose house we belong in. And we find that as the sheep would pass under the rod, if this identifying mark was not easily seen, he would flip back the ear to see, wait, let me make sure. There's one trying to sneak in. Nope, okay, that one's mine. You can go in. And we find the same thing is happening here with Israel as they prepare to go into the land. And the same thing's happening today, isn't it? As we prepare to take back our inheritance. We're being made to pass under the rod. We're being inspected as we're gathered from all the places where we've been scattered. And as we're passing under the rod, he's beginning to inspect your hearing. How well do you shema? How well have you listened? Are your ears marked, indicating that you belong to my flock? Remember John chapter 10, verse 5? Another's voice they won't follow. My sheep hear my voice. Their ears are tuned into me. Why? Because the ears are marked. They're an indicating factor into whose flock we belong to. Well, hearing can be something that's very difficult to gauge, can it? How do we know how well you're hearing? Are you hearing or are you not hearing? What are you hearing? Well, the interesting thing is that hearing can be measured by your level of obedience. Remember Shema? To hear, to understand, to be obedient. Your obedience will measure your hearing. But we also find that there's another factor that's going to measure our hearing. Faith comes by hearing and hearing the word of Yahweh. Your obedience and your level of faith will determine exactly whose house you belong in, and it becomes an indicating factor of whose voice you're listening to. Well, let's look a little bit further. The two-letter root of this term, shavat, is the beit tet. It's the same root that's found in another word, batah. It's Strong's number 981. And this word means to speak rashly or thoughtlessly. Now, none of us have that problem, right? We always think before we speak. It means to babble. It connotes a foolish utterance, but it's specifically dealing with one that would foolishly utter an oath thoughtlessly or flippantly, not understanding the consequences and how serious an oath, a covenant was. Just, yep, all that you said, we'll do. Yep, well, you didn't even hear what I said, but we'll do it. You go get the words, Moses, we'll do it. So it seems as if then maybe that how well we hear the Devarim, the words of Yahweh, and of course, in turn act upon them, it's beginning to expose how seriously we take the covenant. Have we entered into it foolishly, flippantly, not really realizing the seriousness of our oath? Are we one that has tuned our ears into the Devarim? Are we one whose hearing is marked because we belong in this house and we understand that our oath, our covenant, is serious? You realize that the first generation was guilty of making an oath flippantly, foolishly, accepting it, not understanding the terms, and therefore their actions portrayed that, didn't they? They didn't take it serious. Before Moses could make it off the mountain, there was a golden calf. Yet we have to ask the question, how well and how serious do we take it? We find that this same covenant is being given to you and I today. and he's beginning to inspect the house. Have we answered foolishly, flippantly, quickly saying yes because everyone else was saying it, or do we understand the terms? Have we really listened to the Devarim? Now, as we continue to look at this, it begs a further look at the term for shepherd itself. Because everything that we're looking at seems to have this connotation. It's dealing with the shepherd, the rod that you're passing under, how the sheep's ears are marked. John chapter 10, he reveals himself as the good shepherd. Why the shepherd? Have you ever thought of that? Out of all the analogies to reveal himself as, he chose the shepherd and his sheep. Well, let's look at this term for shepherd. In the Hebrew, it's Strong's number 7462, and it's the term ra'ah, and it means to pasture, to graze, to tend, or to feed. But there's a lot more meanings that come birthed out of this root. We find that figuratively this term ra'ah, a shepherd, infers to be one who guards for, who cares for, who rules, one who is a teacher of virtue and wisdom. In other words, whenever you see the term shepherd, not only was it conveying the idea of an individual that was taking care of the physical flocks, the sheep, but it also was an analogy of one who had authority, one who had the ability to rule and to govern, as well as one who was a teacher of wisdom. In other words, a teacher of the Torah, the wisdom of Yahweh. In fact, we find that this was so well known in the ancient Near Eastern culture that a shepherd was synonymous with kingship. And they understood this. This is why even in Egypt, the Pharaoh was connected and often depicted with the shepherd's crook, because to be a shepherd was an analogy of to be king. Your nation was the flock. He was responsible for guarding them, taking care of them. And now you can begin to understand why Yeshua makes the statement, I'm the good shepherd. Well, in their mindset, they understood when he said shepherd, it was connecting to the fact that he just made his claim that I'm the good king. I come in the authority of Yahweh. He's actually declaring his role that he is the king. And it's interesting because now you can understand. Why wouldn't they understand that analogy? We find that after he declares that he's the good shepherd, the people don't understand it. They look at him. They're baffled by this declaration. And it seems to be quite simple. Why are they baffled? Because he's just made the declaration that he's the good king, and yet they're watching him, and he's doing nothing that is setting up his authority in the earth, is he? Instead, he's coming as the servant. And yet he's declaring, I'm the king, and yet they're watching him, and everything he does, he's not ruling or having dominion over the land, over the people. He's not setting up his government. And then he goes on and he lets them know that the role of the shepherd, a good shepherd, is to give his life for the flock. And he baffles them, and they realize he's just made the declaration, I'm the king. I'm the one who has authority and dominion, but I'm choosing to lay down my life for my flock. I'm choosing to lay down myself, to put all that aside, to come as the suffering servant. And because of this, now you're going to be able to gain access to the inheritance. You realize why at the end some of the people that didn't agree with him are ready to stone him? At the end of this conversation, we find that he just revealed to them, I'm the one that has the right to grant you access to your inheritance. Now with this understanding, if we backtrack, if this is truly the case, if this was the understanding of what a shepherd was, of what a shepherd represented, when you go back and you begin to look in Genesis, it's quite comical because again and again we find that there's always a problem with the shepherds. And from the English, from our first glance, it seems as if, well, there just wasn't enough crops, there wasn't enough land for the sheep to feed, so the shepherds always argued with each other over where they're going to feed the flocks. But let's look at this because I believe there's something different. The first time we see a problem that deals with the shepherd is in Genesis chapter 4, verse 2. We don't even hardly get out of the garden, and already there's a problem concerning the role of the shepherd. In Genesis 4:2, we're told, and she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper, a rah, he was a shepherd of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And if you're familiar with the story of Cain and Abel, we know that Cain kills Abel. But upon closer examination, this wasn't just a heated argument that went too far. Instead, if this is truly the role of the shepherd is the one that teaches wisdom. The shepherd's the one that's responsible for the covenant. The shepherd's the one that has the authority and the dominion in the house. If this is what the shepherd represents, then this brotherly dispute becomes something quite different, doesn't it? It's a dispute for the authority in the house. Abel, as the shepherd, as the firstborn of Adam, is entrusted with the Devarim, the words. He's responsible to be the priest, the king in the household after Adam. He's to govern and teach the rest of the house how to be obedient to the covenant with the great king. And yet we find Cain, the serpent seed, who's unwilling to do so, cuts off the shepherd in the house. It's a battle over authority. It's a battle over dominion. Who's going to be the head? Who's going to have authority in the house? We fast forward to Genesis chapter 13, verse 7. And Genesis 26:20, once again, there's disputes with the shepherds. The shepherds of Abraham and Lot strive with each other. Genesis 26, the shepherds of Gerar and Isaac strive with each other. When you look, we find that Abraham and Isaac both represented the covenant, didn't they? Abraham was given the covenant. Yahweh walks between the pieces. Abraham has a covenant with the great king. He's given the document deed to the land. But yet his shepherds, the one that represent the authority of his house, have problems with Lot. If you look at the term Lot, it comes from a root meaning the flesh, a fleshly covering, the very opposite of one who's circumcised, walking in covenant. If we look at Gerar and Isaac, Isaac's the covenant son. He's the promised son, the son of the covenant, the one that the covenant is passed on to. The shepherds of Gerar have an issue with him. What does Gerar mean? It comes from the root meaning stranger and exile. They're a stranger to the covenant. They're not inside the house. They're one who's outside this covenant. They haven't agreed to the terms of the treaty. But where things get really interesting, because all the dots have to connect, right? Or if not, we're just pulling things out of a hat. The term that's used in both of these verses, it says that they strive with each other. The word strive, in both instances, it comes from the same root. It's Strong's number 7379 or 7378. Both meaning rib is the word in the Hebrew. And it means strife, controversy, a dispute. Well, okay. But if you continue to look, we find that specifically this word is used to describe a case at law. It's the description used to describe a covenant lawsuit. It is the same word used to describe how when a vassal king or nation, a nation that was a servant, a king that was a servant to a greater nation or a greater king, if that servant nation and its king violated the terms of the treaty that they had made with the greater power, then the great king, who in this case is Yahweh, would bring a covenant lawsuit, a rib, same word used, that would ensue because they were violating the terms of the contract. Well, isn't that interesting? Because the same word here used to describe the battle between these two sets of shepherds, it's a covenant lawsuit. So we find then that if this is the case, this isn't just a battle over where the flocks are going to eat. It's not just a battle over who has access to these wells, to this property for the flocks, but instead we find that it's a battle over who has authority in the land. Whose inheritance is it? Who reigns as king? And we find that in order to deal with this controversy, it's up to Abraham, it's up to Isaac to present their case. A legal covenant lawsuit ensues based on the terms of the covenant, based on the Devarim that was given to them by Yahweh. Now you can begin to understand why it's so important that you know your Torah. You know the words, why the king had to write it. This is the treaty that gives you access to this inheritance. And there may come a point in time where the enemy is going to attempt to take that inheritance from you. And just like Abraham, just like Isaac, you'll be responsible for bringing a covenant lawsuit and declaring your case. Letting them know, here's the deed, I have the document. I've kept the terms of the contract. Well, let's look a little bit further. In Genesis 13:19, we find that Abraham's solution to this issue is to separate from Lot. Well, if this dot connects, then perhaps this truly is the case. Let's look a little bit further. Does this connect to the idea that it's a covenant lawsuit? Does it connect to the idea that this is a battle between who's having authority in the land, whose inheritance it is? The word separate is Strong's number 6504 in the Hebrew. It's parad, and it means to separate, to divide. The interesting thing, though, is that it has a two-letter root of the resh dalet. The resh dalet root comes from the term radah, and it means to rule, to have dominion, to subjugate. It conveys the notion of having dominion, exercising that dominion in one's domain. It's related to the exercise of authority by a king or priest over his kingdom. And the interesting thing is that in this term, to separate, parad, on the front of it's the letter pei. It represents the mouth, the words. It was by the mouth of Abraham, by the words, the Devarim that would come out of his mouth, that he was going to either exercise dominion in the inheritance that Yahweh gave him, or he was going to lack dominion and his inheritance would be taken from him. Do you realize the same thing can be said of you and I? By the words that will come out of your mouth, you'll either have dominion, subjugate it, have control of your inheritance like you're supposed to, or your words will give up your inheritance. Don't want it, don't need it, aren't willing to fight for it. And therefore someone else will willingly take it over. We find that when we look here, Abraham exercises his authority as the high priest in the earth and the vassal king who represented Yahweh. He knew who he represented. He knew who had his back. He knew he had a covenant, and no one was about to take his inheritance from him. And we find that Abraham, as he exercises his authority, he subjugates the inheritance that was given to him. And we find here that Israel is expected to do the same thing. They're going right back into the same land. Someone else had dominion over it. Someone else has been practicing authority, masquerading as the kings in the land. And yet Israel's being reminded, this is your inheritance. It's now time for you to go and take it back. Subjugate it. Have dominion. Exercise authority over it, because this, having control of the land, was actually the measuring rod, if you will, of how well they were keeping covenant. Do you realize that? To be in the land, to have possession of the land, was an indicator that they were in right relationship with Yahweh and they were keeping the covenant like they were supposed to. The moment they didn't, they're exiled. The land was important. You realize your inheritance is important? Maybe not your physical property, but all the other things, the promises that He's given you, our dominion over these promises, having them evident in our lives becomes an indicator of how well we're keeping covenant. And this is why we find that the entire book of Deuteronomy, it's a legal document. It's written out in treaty form so they would have a legal right, they would understand their rights, and they would know that when you go into the land, this becomes your foundation to wage war against those that have taken it over. If we continue to look, we find in Genesis 37:2 another battle ensuing over the shepherds. This one deals with Joseph. We're told Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. He's the shepherd. He's the one that's been given the dominion, the authority in the house, and he's exercising that. He's feeding the flock in the house. We're told, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. If you're familiar with chapter 37, we know that this becomes the tip of the iceberg onto a long chain of events that happens, doesn't it? We find that Joseph is feeding the flocks. He goes to find his brethren who are supposed to be feeding the flocks, and they're not there. They're not in Shechem. And when they're reported upon, we see that there's this battle between the two. One who's doing what he's supposed to, feeding the flocks, being the shepherd, continuing to teach the covenant, and the others who are not. And Joseph gets kicked out. We find that Joseph goes into exile because of his brothers. Well, isn't it interesting that to Joseph's descendants the same thing happens? We understand that those that are scattered, they're often identified as the descendants of Joseph, aren't they? Ephraim. It's Judah and Ephraim. And we find that Ephraim has been in exile, hasn't he? We've been stripped of our inheritance. We've been outside the house just like Joseph was. And yet we're being reminded that doesn't negate the fact that Ephraim has an inheritance. Just because you're not there doesn't negate the fact that Ephraim has a role in the house. Joseph's role was he was teaching the Torah to the house. He was being a shepherd. And we find that as Ephraim today is being woken up and the exiles are beginning to awaken to who they are, you're being reminded you have a role as well. Joseph was a shepherd. Joseph was to teach the Torah. Joseph was to have authority in the house. And yet, we're being reminded, but now we have to go back and we have to learn the Devarim first, don't we? There's no way for us to come into the house and claim, that's our inheritance, it's mine, if we don't have an understanding of the Devarim. That's why we don't control it yet, because we're still having to relearn, change our minds, renew it. Why? Because you're never going to get access to your inheritance unless you go through the Devarim, unless you go through the words. When we fast forward to Genesis 46:34, once again, there's a debate with the shepherds. Told you again and again. In Genesis 46:34, the statement is made that you shall say, this is Joseph speaking. Isn't it interesting how the tables turned? Joseph gets thrown out of the house, but now the house comes to him because there's a famine, and Joseph becomes the source. He makes a statement to his brothers. He says that you shall say, thy servant's trade has been about cattle from our youth even until now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. We find that what's taking place here is Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers. Pharaoh knows that Joseph's family is here, but as Joseph is preparing his family to go in and to meet Pharaoh, to petition Pharaoh to live in Pharaoh's land, to be provided for in the midst of the famine, he tells his brothers something interesting. Don't you tell him you're shepherds. Don't you dare tell Pharaoh that. Tell him you work with cattle, because a shepherd is an abomination. When we look at this term abomination, it's the word toibah, Strong's number 8441, and it means a disgusting thing, an abomination, something abominable. But remember, we've already stated the fact that a shepherd signified kingship, royalty, someone who had dominion, someone who had authority. Even in Egypt, they understood this. Pharaoh with the shepherd's crook. Why would a shepherd be an abomination if Pharaoh himself has a shepherd's crook? Could it be that if they were to go to Pharaoh and say that they were shepherds because of the understanding, because Pharaoh understood what a shepherd represented, that to go to Pharaoh and declare we're shepherds would immediately let Pharaoh know we're a ruling party as well? We're ones that are used to having dominion and authority and position, and we're now here and they become a rival for the throne of Pharaoh? Well, let's look a little bit further. This term toibah comes from the root toa, Strong's number 8442, and it means an error, a disturbance, trouble. It indicates confusion and perversion. Specifically, it describes a confusion or disturbance that's raised among people by troublemakers. For them to come in and proclaim to Pharaoh that they're shepherds, it immediately would let Pharaoh know they're fixing to cause trouble for him among people, because they represented a different government, a different law, a different covenant, a different treaty. And so we find that for the Israelites to identify themselves as shepherds would be to identify themselves as kings and persons of authority, having the potential to disturb the reign of Pharaoh in Egypt, bringing confusion and becoming troublemakers among the people for the powers that be. Do you realize that you too are called to be shepherds? We're called to be an individual that would walk in this manner of authority, to subjugate, to have dominion. And you should be a problem for the powers that be. And yet so often we find that just as Joseph told his brothers, we're still operating under that. We're not shepherds. Nope. I have no dominion. I have no authority. Don't plan to, don't want to. And we go the other way. We turn our face. We don't deal with things. We don't get involved. Don't want to rock the boat. And yet we're being reminded it's now time to go into the land. It's now time to take your inheritance. For a time, that was a role, but now you're being reminded, know the Devarim. It's time to take authority. It's time to take possession. Now, it's no accident that in Deuteronomy chapter 1:8, there's a play on words with the term shepherd itself. In Deuteronomy 1:8, in this Torah portion, they're told, behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them. The word for behold there is ra'ah. It's spelled resh, aleph, hey. It sounds exactly like the term for shepherd, which is also ra'ah. The difference is it's spelled with the ayin instead of an aleph. The term ra'ah means to see, to look at, to inspect, to perceive, and consider, and yet to hear this word instantly reminds them of the term ra'ah, shepherd. Could it be that if you're going to go into the land, if you're going to fulfill this task of claiming it, you're going to have to understand the role of the shepherd? You're going to have to understand the role of one who could exercise dominion and authority based on the covenantal promises? That this is the purpose of what's being revealed to them? They would have to understand the Devarim, the words of Yahweh, if they're going to subjugate the inhabitants of the land and claim their inheritance. If not, we find that a lot of times we go into battle with the enemy, and because we don't understand the Devarim, because we have no foundation, we have no idea of how to exercise our legal right, how to come before the judge and plead a case, we find that the majority of the time we leave out of this battle worse off than we went in. Sometimes just as bad as the 7 sons of Sceva. Because we find that we're told, Yeshua I know, Paul I know. Why? Because they understood the words. They understood how to battle, how to do this. And yet when we go and we have no idea, and we come out losing more than what we've gained. And yet we're being reminded, just as the children of Israel are, this becomes the legal precedent. This becomes your foundation. This is how you're going to have dominion and authority. It's only by understanding the Devarim. It's only by understanding the words and understanding that it's Yahweh that you're representing. You're the vassal. You're coming in His authority. Let's look a little further. We must look at the significance that this happens to be the 44th Torah portion of the year. 44, as we've already said, numbers are important. 44 is a number that's associated with judgment of the entire world. And it seems to be emphasizing then that this Torah portion, these words, these Devarim, are spoken for a generation that's going to see judgment of the entire world, which happens to be the generation at the end that's going to see Yahweh sitting as judge. And we find that these words, you're being admonished, you're being reminded to understand them. Why? Because they give you a legal right to enter into His house. When He sits as judge and He's inspecting who's coming in, if you've been obedient to the Devarim, the door is open. The interesting thing, though, is that 44, it's 4 times 11. 4 is the door, right? 11 we looked at as well. It can either mean disorder, chaos, or it can mean to have inheritance, to have authority, to possess an inheritance. Do you realize that in the midst of the judgment that the whole world is going to see, you have a choice of 2 doors? You will either enter through the door that leads you to your inheritance because you were obedient and listened to the Devarim, or the door is going to be open in your life for chaos and disorder because just like the generation that's killed off, we refuse to be obedient to the Devarim. 44, judgment. The interesting thing, though, is that when you continue to look at this number 44, in astronomy, it's associated with the cluster of stars in a constellation known as Cancer, and this particular constellation is known as the Beehive Cluster. And many people, as believers, have strayed away from looking at anything to do with the stars because it was perverted by the enemy and it was worshipped. And yet we understand that Yahweh, as the Creator, put them there for signs and for seasons. They're placed there to declare His glory. It's the handiwork of His hands. And when we begin to look, we find that they actually foretell and speak of the salvation message of Yahweh. Well, let's look at this a little closer. This particular cluster of stars that's associated with this number 44 is known as the Beehive Cluster, but it's in the constellational house of Cancer. Today, just to show you how perverted things have become, Cancer is seen as a crab. Historically, though, in the ancient world, it was named Sartan in the Hebrew, and it was depicted as a sheepfold. In the Coptic, it was named Claria, another ancient name of it, and it was known as the cattlefolds or the sheepfolds. And in fact, the term Sartan in Hebrew meant the one who holds or binds. We find that 2 other constellations are found in this house, Ursa Minor and Ursa Major, the little bear and the great bear. Once again, a perversion. Originally, they depicted 2 sheepfolds to the ancient world. Perhaps the 2 houses, Judah and Ephraim, the 2 sticks, the 2 sheepfolds. But to truly understand the significance, let's look at that thing, the Beehive Cluster of stars. Bee in Hebrew is the word Deborah. It's from the root word Debar, the word. Do you realize the picture that's placed in the heavens, what it declares? Yahweh places us in the heavens to declare that once again He's going to place His Debar, His Devarim, His words, where? Within His sheepfolds, His people. Why is it important that He places His word within His people? So that you would understand that you have a legal right to your inheritance, so that you could successfully subdue the enemies that are and will be inhabiting your inheritance, the land. But if you have the Devarim, the words, in the midst of the sheepfold, then you'll be one that's successful and is able to conquer and have dominion, walking in covenant. Now, as we continue to look at this, it all seems to be hinging on the Devarim, how we handle it, what we do with it, how do we listen to it, are we obedient to it, do we ignore it or not? Well, the interesting thing is that when you look at this term, Debar, word, we've already looked at the way it's spelled, Dalet, Beit, Resh. Well, the same letters that compose Devar, if you rearrange these same letters, they form another word, Bidar, Beit Dalet Resh, and it means to scatter. You realize that he's letting you know from the word itself, if you neglect the Devarim, if you neglect the words of Yahweh, then you're going to be unable to enter into his house and unable to once again gain access to the inheritance, to the promised land, to the Debar land, and we become a people that are Bedar. We become a people that are scattered. In fact, in Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, he describes it this way. He says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of Yahweh, I will also forget thy children." We have no inheritance. We have no one to pass it on. He forgets our children. He forgets the offspring. Why? Because we didn't acknowledge the Devarim. The inheritance gets cut off. We're scattered. We remain scattered unless we choose to acknowledge that he's the door. The Devarim, the words we listen to, gain us access back into the house. Now, if we go back and we look at that message that's in the heavens, the constellational houses, there's a very interesting picture that begins to take place, because you have the house of Cancer, or the sheepfolds, and they're directly facing the constellational house of Leo, the lion. And we understand that the lion represents Yeshua, the Messiah, the lion of the tribe of Judah. And when you see these two constellational houses facing one another, it's indicating there's an encounter on the horizon. And we find that the purpose of why his word's being placed in the sheepfold is in preparation for this encounter. We find that the word's being placed in the sheepfold so that you would have access, you would have a door that was open to you for you to once again gain access to his presence, so that you could come into his house. The interesting thing is that in the Arabic, the ancient Arabic, the name of Leo was Al-Asad, and it meant a lion coming vehemently, leaping forth as a flame. So often we picture Yeshua as that gentle little lamb, don't we? A loving God, one who would not do anything to harm us. He loves us. We're his spotted little puppies. He just allows all kind of manner of things. He forgives. He's so merciful. And yet we're being reminded that in the coming days, he came as the lamb already, and he gave you access to the door so you could come in. He restored your inheritance. He did the work. The king laid down his life so you could once again have access. And yet you're being reminded that the word's being poured out now because the lamb's not coming back. The lion's coming back. And when the reigning king comes back, he's about to wage war against those that have caused the inheritance to be neglected. He's about to raise war against those that have neglected the treaty and haven't kept the terms. And he's coming back as a lion that's leaping forth as a flame. Well, let me ask you a question. What does the fire burn up? It burns the stubble, doesn't it? In Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 24, we're told, "Therefore will I scatter them as the stubble that passeth away by the wind of the wilderness." The word stubble in Hebrew is kash, and it means stubble or chaff. But I want you to notice that it's spelled kuf sheen. Kuf sheen is staff, chaff or stubble. It's the same two-letter root that's found in the word kadosh, kuf dalet sheen. What's the difference between holiness, kadosh, and chaff? Kadosh has the dalet. Chaff doesn't have the dalet. We find that the door has been accessed by those that are seen as holy. Those that don't access the door become the stubble. They're the chaff. We find that in the days ahead, it seems that when you face the lion who's leaping forth as a flame, the way that you're going to handle his presence, the way that this encounter is going to go, it's all going to depend upon what you did with the door. When the lion comes, we find, and he's burning as a flame, if you've accessed the door, if you've recognized him as the door, if you've listened to his word, his Devarim, if your ear is showing that you're hearing, you're being obedient, you belong in this house, then that fire is going to purify you. It's going to make you holy. You'll be a kadosh, holy, set-apart people. But if we've neglected the door, if we haven't listened to the Devarim, if our hearing does not portray that we've been obedient, that we've been doing what we've been supposed to be doing with this covenant treaty, then we find that when this fire, this lion that's leaping forth as a flame arrives, that will be burnt up as stubble and chaff. And it all is depending upon whether or not we access the door, whether or not we've lent our ears to his Devarim, to his words. And now you can begin to understand why it's so important This is why he promises that he's going to pour out revelation knowledge in the days that you and I are living in. That he's going to restore pure language. Why? So you can understand the covenant. So you can understand the document that you've been given. Never before have we heard what we're hearing today, and the reason is because he's coming back as a leaping flame, and it's time that we understood. Before in the past, he winked at our ignorance. At the past, he extended mercy to us because we didn't know any better. But now he's come, he's restored it, and now he's coming back to see, what have you done with it since I've been gone? Have you made my enemies my footstool while I was waiting for you to subjugate, to have dominion, to do what I told you to do? Or have we been like chaff, like stubble, those that really didn't pay attention or listen? We were supposed to do what? We're reminded again and again, he tells us, he that hath an ear, let him hear. And that becomes the message of this Torah portion. Let him hear the Devarim, the words of Yahweh. Thank you for listening. Shabbat Shalom.